access modifiers and scope. Now we're going to talk about the keywords that you can put in front of your variables, your classes, enums, structures, interfaces, all those things, all those types within the .NET C# world that need to have an access level. You can define them as public or private, protected, internal, or protected internal. So when you don't define a class as public or private, you're saying that you want it to be private. Same thing with structures, private. Enums are going to be public as well as interfaces. Your member variables are going to be private if you don't specify whether they should be private or public. And you can see we can do that, public or private. You should place them as public or private so people know exactly what you're talking about when you're showing your code to them, and it also just makes things very, very clear. Now, when you're working with your members here, whether they're the methods or whether they're your variables here, whatever you're going to do, you're going to define public or private or protected internal or protected internal. Public means that it's accessible to everybody. Everybody can see it. They can get at it. They can get at your data. Well, we know that we want to encapsulate our data. We'll see that in object-oriented programming. You know that you want to encapsulate the data so it's more like a black box. You don't have access to the data itself, but you have to access members or properties, like this is a property, as you can see here. And this is how you would access this particular member variable here, X. So you don't just give everybody access to that. So you define them as private, and then you define public properties here, or public methods, to manipulate those underlying data values there. And that's the normal way to do that. You'll see that in object-oriented programming, like I mentioned. Private is only going to have access to that particular class. That's going to be very important when we talk about the object-oriented features as well, because if you derive classes, you use inheritance, you want to be able to access these private variables. Well, then you're going to have to define them as protected. When you define something as protected, then you give access to that class and any derived classes. To derive a class means to inherit that class. So when you inherit a class and you have protected information within that class, protected members, then you're going to have access to those. Public, of course, you're going to have access to as well, but protected is going to give you that extra bit to actually use and work with, more specifically your variables that you might have up top, your fields, and normally you would define those protected that you want to give access to. Internal is only going to be internal to the assembly, so anything within the assembly can have access to it if it's internal. Furthermore, protected internal, and we'll see and talk about these other ways when we work with the object-oriented. This is going to give access to the assembly or derived classes from a class in the assembly. So if there's a class in the assembly that something else somewhere else in another assembly is going to derive from, because it is allowed to do that, well then you're going to have access to those members as well that are declared protected internal. And again, this deals with your access, giving access to fields. So for example, if we try to access that private variable X down here, we have one class here, cPrinter, and we have another class here, cMain_class, which is the main class. If we actually try to access the private data, we'll just do that here. Well, we'll do it after we declare the class. Down here, c1.x, lowercase. Well, you can't really get to the lowercase. You don't see it there. It's not public. So you'll see what you have available here that you can access. So we'll just do it anyway. And then we'll take a peek back up at top and we'll say, all right, what else do we have here? S to print. Well, if we do that again, it's not listed. It's not public because it's not declared, so it's assumed to be private. So we'll just do a little debug here, and we can see, well, it's inaccessible due to its protection level, S to print, and X is also inaccessible due to its protection level. Can't do that. So it takes care of it for us. You get the hint when you look at the IntelliSense, the code hinting. So you get that hint, and then you know for sure. You have to access based on the accessibility. And this will be based on the access modifier. The access modifier is modifying the access, giving you access. That's that keyword, access modifier.